"They broke my body for fun," cried the poor widow to the Amish man, her voice trembling in the snow outside his quiet forge. He could have turned her away, but when he carried her inside, wrapped her in a quilt, and heard what those men had done, something inside him broke, too. He'd sworn never to raise a hand again after the war. Yet now, mercy and justice were fighting inside his soul. The town whispered she was cursed. The railroad men hunted her like wolves, and hidden in her torn shawl was a paper, proof that could bring the whole valley to its knees. As the forge flames rise and the past comes roaring back, will a man of peace stand by and let evil win, or risk his soul to save a broken woman no one else would protect? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The winter wind howled across the Colorado Valley like a hungry wolf, rattling the wooden walls of Eli Gundon's forge. Inside, the massive blacksmith worked alone, his steady hammer strikes echoing against the constant whistle of the storm. Sparks flew from his anvil, each blow shaping the red-hot metal into what would become a wagon wheel rim. The forge's warmth wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the storm's particular fury, or perhaps the way the shadows danced longer against the walls. Eli paused, running a rough hand across his beard. At times like these, the emptiness of his home pressed harder against his heart. The clatter of wagon wheels broke through the wind's moan. Eli set down his hammer, surprised anyone would brave such weather. Through the shop's frosted window, he could make out the shape of a freight wagon, its team of horses fighting against the growing drifts. Cole Danner, a familiar freight driver, half stumbled through the door in a swirl of snow. "Got yourself a problem here, Gundon," he called out, his voice gruff with worry. "Found her wandering near the railroad camp. She's in a bad way." Eli followed Cole to the wagon, where a woman lay huddled beneath several worn blankets. Her face was pale as new milk, her lips blue with cold. When they tried to help her down, she flinched away, terror flashing in her eyes. "Easy now," Cole muttered. "You're safe here. Eli Gundon's good folk. Plain folk." The woman's gaze found Eli's face, studying him through pain-glazed eyes. Something in his calm demeanor seemed to reach her, and she allowed them to help her from the wagon. Her legs gave way as soon as her feet touched ground. "They broke my body for fun," she whispered through cracked lips, before slumping against Eli's chest. Eli caught her gently, his heart thundering against his ribs. The proper thing would be to send her to town, to avoid any hint of scandal. But town was 5 miles away through the teeth of the storm, and the woman clearly needed immediate care. "I'll take her, inside," Eli said quietly. Cole nodded, relief clear on his weathered face. "Reckon that's best. Name's Lydia Holcomb. Least that's what she told me. I'd stay, but I've got freight that won't wait." Cole climbed back onto his wagon, then paused. "You're a better man than most, Gundon. The Lord sees it, even if you don't believe it yourself." Eli carried Lydia into his house, her weight slight in his arms. The quilt his wife had made still lay folded in the trunk, unused since her passing. He wrapped Lydia in it, noting the bruises visible on her wrists and neck, the torn clothing, the dried blood in her hair. His hands shook as he lit the lamp, anger and pity warring in his chest. As he tended her wounds with what skill he had, Lydia drifted in and out of consciousness. Fragments of her story emerged in broken whispers: a schoolteacher's widow, a railroad company's greed, men who thought silence could be bought with violence. Each word landed like hammer blows on Eli's conscience. The storm raged on as night deepened. Eli sat in his chair by the bed, watching the lamplight flicker across Lydia's face. His vow of peace had seemed so clear when he'd made it. A way to atone for that one terrible moment during the war when rage had mastered him. But now, listening to this wounded woman's breathing, he wondered if true peace sometimes required more than passive acceptance. Dawn found him still awake, his thoughts circling like the snow outside. The first gray light crept through the windows, touching Lydia's face. She stirred, her eyes opening with a start of fear before focusing on him. "You stayed," she whispered. "Yeah," he answered simply. "You're safe here." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why help me? You don't know me." Eli considered his words carefully. "Because mercy isn't about knowing. It's about choosing." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before pain drew it away. She closed her eyes again, exhaustion pulling her back into sleep. Eli rose quietly and went to stoke the fire. The storm had passed, but he knew in his heart that the true tempest was just beginning. Whatever came next would test everything he believed about peace, justice, and the cost of doing right in a world gone wrong. The morning light grew stronger, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pearl and gold. In his forge, the banked coals still glowed, waiting to be awakened. Eli stood in his doorway, watching the sunrise. His vow of peace sat heavy on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, it felt less like a burden and more like a choice he would have to make anew each day. Morning painted the valley in pristine white, the storm's fury transformed into peaceful drifts. Eli stood at his barn door, watching his breath cloud in the crisp air as he hitched his team to the sleigh. The horses stamped impatiently, their movements creating small storms of powdery snow. His mind wandered to his guest, now sleeping fitfully in his house. Before leaving, he had stoked the fire and left water within her reach. The memory of her bruised face strengthened his resolve as he guided the horses through the fresh snow toward the Stoltzfus farm. Bea and Jonas lived in a neat, white farmhouse a mile down the valley. Smoke curled from their chimney into the crystal-clear sky. As Eli's sleigh approached, Jonas appeared on the porch, his expression curious but concerned. "What brings you out so early, Eli?" Jonas called, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "I need Bea's help," Eli replied simply. "There's a woman—" Jonas nodded gravely and disappeared inside. Moments later, he returned with Bea, who was already pulling on her heavy black shawl. No more words were needed. They understood the urgency in Eli's tone. The ride back was silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath the runners. Bea gathered her medicines from beneath the sleigh's seat, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. Jonas kept his eyes forward, but his presence offered silent support. Inside Eli's house, they found Lydia awake, pressed against the headboard, her eyes wide with fear at the sound of strangers. Bea approached slowly, her gentle manner easing some of the tension from Lydia's shoulders. "I'm Bea Stoltzfus," she said softly. "Let's see what we can do to ease your hurting." While Jonas and Eli waited in the kitchen, Bea tended to Lydia's wounds. The older woman's hands were gentle but thorough as she cleaned and bandaged the worst injuries. As she helped Lydia change into a clean nightgown, something fell from the folds of the torn shawl, a carefully stitched piece of paper. Bea glanced at it, noting columns of numbers and railroad company letterhead, before tucking it discreetly into her apron pocket. When she emerged, her face was grave. "She needs rest and care," Bea said quietly. "But Eli, keeping her here—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There will be talk." "I know," Eli replied simply. Bea shared a look with Jonas, who nodded slightly. "We'll help where we can," she said. "But you should speak with Bishop Enoch. Better he hears this from you first." Eli found Bishop Enoch Lapp in his study, surrounded by well-worn books of scripture. The bishop listened without expression as Eli explained the situation, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The world's sins are not your burden to bear, Eli Gundon," the bishop said finally, his voice stern but not unkind. "Our way is one of separation from such violence." "Would you have me turn her away?" Eli asked quietly. The bishop's eyes narrowed slightly. "I would have you remember your vows to our community. Remember what happened the last time you took the world's troubles upon yourself." Eli felt the familiar weight of shame at the reference to his wartime transgression, but something else burned stronger in his chest: certainty. "I remember my vows," he said, "but I also remember Christ's words about mercy." The ride home was long, the bishop's warnings echoing in his mind. As he approached his property, the sharp ring of metal on metal cut through the air, his apprentice working in the forge. The sound made him hurry inside, remembering Lydia's fear. He found her huddled in the corner, shaking at each strike of the hammer. Without a word, he knelt beside her, keeping a careful distance. "You're safe here," he said gently. "Those sounds, they're just my forge, where I shape metal for wagons and plows. God's work, not man's violence." Lydia's trembling slowly eased as he spoke of his work, of how metal could be transformed from crude ore to useful tools that helped things grow. As evening approached, he stoked the fire in both house and forge, the latter's glow casting warm light through the windows as snow began falling again. He prepared a simple broth, rich with vegetables from his cellar. Lydia sat propped against pillows, accepting small spoonfuls. Tears cut clean tracks through the soot that had settled on her face. But she ate in silence, each swallow seeming to require all her strength. The forge's warmth seeped through the walls, wrapping them in a pocket of safety as darkness gathered outside. Eli knew the coming days would bring challenges: the community's judgment, the bishop's disapproval, the weight of responsibility for this wounded stranger. But watching Lydia finally relax enough to truly rest, he felt a deep certainty that this was exactly where mercy had led him. Dawn crept through the windows of Eli's home, casting long shadows across worn floorboards. Lydia stood shakily, gripping the bedpost for support. Her legs trembled, but determination shone in her eyes as she surveyed the dusty room. "I can't lie abed forever," she said softly, more to herself than to Eli, who watched from the doorway with concern etched on his face. Despite her weakness, Lydia insisted on helping around the forge. She moved slowly, gathering scattered tools and arranging them on the workbench. The simple task seemed to give her purpose, though Eli noticed how she flinched at sudden movements or loud sounds. "I'll leave once I can walk properly," Lydia announced, straightening a row of hammers. "I won't burden you longer than necessary." Before Eli could respond, the door creaked open, and B. Stoltzfus entered, carrying a basket of fresh bread and dried herbs. Her eyes took in the scene: Lydia's determined stance, Eli's worried expression. "Nonsense," B. said firmly, setting down her basket. "Winter's hardly begun. Where would you go?" She touched Lydia's arm gently. "The Lord brought you here for a reason, child." Later that afternoon, Eli sat by the fire, mending Lydia's torn shawl. His large hands, usually more comfortable with iron than needle, worked carefully through the worn fabric. As he turned the shawl over, something caught his eye: a carefully stitched pocket containing a folded paper. Unfolding it revealed columns of neat writing. Partial list of land parcels, each marked with rail easement clearance and a date. Though he didn't understand all the terms, something about the document made his skin prickle with unease. Without a word, he crossed to the shelf where his father's Bible lay and slipped the paper into its pages. The evening meal was simple: bean soup and fresh bread, but the warmth of the kitchen invited confidence. Lydia stared into her bowl, speaking softly but clearly. "My husband taught school in Missouri," she began. "The railroad wanted to run tracks through our town. They needed signatures from property owners, but Jacob, my husband, he noticed something wrong with the claims. Numbers that didn't match, dates that couldn't be true." Eli listened intently, his own soup growing cold. "They offered him money to sign anyway. When he refused..." Her voice caught. "3 railroad guards came to our home. They made me watch as they beat him. Said he needed to learn his place." Her hands trembled on the table. "He died 2 days later. But that wasn't enough for them. They came back to teach me a lesson about keeping quiet." The silence that followed felt heavy as forge iron. Eli's mind drifted to his own past, the day he'd walked away from his Union regiment, choosing his faith over fighting. How many had died while he kept his hands clean? The memory of shame mixed with fresh guilt as he looked at Lydia's bruised face. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate against such pain. "Don't be," Lydia replied. "You've shown me more kindness than I dared hope for." After supper, Eli retreated to the barn for evening prayers. The familiar smell of hay and horse leather surrounded him as he knelt in the darkness. His conscience wrestled with competing duties, his vow of peace, his obligation to protect, the growing certainty that sometimes silence served evil as surely as violence. "Lord," he whispered, "show me the difference between peace and cowardice." The next morning broke clear and cold. Eli emerged from the barn to find Lydia standing in the yard, face turned toward the rising sun. She limped slightly but stood straighter than before, her borrowed dress hanging loose on her thin frame. "I won't be idle," she declared as he approached. "I can clean, cook, keep accounts, whatever work needs doing." Her voice carried the same quiet determination he'd noticed when she arranged his tools. "I mean to earn my keep, Mr. Gundon." Eli nodded, recognizing in her stance something he understood well: the healing power of useful work, of having purpose. "The forge could use a proper cleaning," he said carefully, "if you're feeling strong enough." He watched as she made her way towards the workshop, moving slowly but purposefully. The ledger hidden in his Bible weighed on his mind, connecting her private suffering to larger wrongs. His fingers unconsciously traced the scar on his palm, a reminder of his last act of violence, years ago. Now, watching Lydia's courage in the morning light, he wondered if God was asking something new of him, not to fight, perhaps, but to stand firm against injustice in some other way. Word traveled fast through the Amish settlement, carried on winter winds and whispered around dinner tables. "Did you hear about Eli Gundon?" the voices would start. "Taking in that Englishwoman, and her reputation being what it is." The forge grew quieter as regular customers found reasons to delay repairs or visit other blacksmiths. Women who once brought Eli fresh-baked bread now hurried past his property, heads turned away. Even the children no longer paused to watch him work the bellows. One crisp morning, hoofbeats approached the forge. Sheriff Amos Kincaid dismounted, his weathered face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Eli set down his hammer, wiping sooty hands on his apron. "Morning, Eli," the sheriff said, stamping snow from his boots. "Been meaning to ride out." They stood in the doorway of the forge, steam rising from the quenching barrel between them. The sheriff's next words came careful and measured. "Some railroad men been asking around about a witness, woman named Lydia Holcomb." He watched Eli's face closely. "Say she might have some papers that don't belong to her. Dangerous men, these ones. Not the sort to let things go." Eli's expression remained steady, though his heart quickened. "Much obliged for the warning, Sheriff." Just doing my job, Kincaid replied. Mighty cold winter to be traveling alone. His emphasis on the last word carried clear meaning. With a touch to his hat brim, he mounted and rode away. Later that afternoon, Lydia went to draw water from the community well. As she worked the pump handle, voices drifted from behind the nearby meeting house. "It ain't natural, him keeping her there," one woman whispered. "She'll bring nothing but trouble, mark my words." "A curse on our settlement," another agreed. "Did you hear what they say she done?" The pump handle slipped from Lydia's grasp, clanging against the well's stone wall. The whispers cut off abruptly. She grabbed her bucket, sloshing water over her skirts as she hurried back to the forge. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across new-fallen snow, Eli found Lydia sitting alone by the window, her face drawn with hurt. "Would you walk with me?" he asked quietly. "The creek's frozen solid now." They followed the creek's winding path, their boots crunching through crusted snow. Leafless trees stood like black lace against the darkening sky. Neither spoke until they reached a bend where ice had formed intricate patterns along the banks. "I heard them at the well," Lydia said finally, her voice thin as winter wind. "Perhaps I should go before I bring more trouble to your door." Eli studied the frozen creek, choosing his words with care. "Truth is like this water," he said. "Right now it seems stuck, frozen in place, but spring always comes. Ice breaks, water flows again." He turned to face her. "Truth has its season to thaw." Back at the house, they found B. Stoltzfus waiting, her usual calm demeanor troubled. She held out the ledger page Eli had hidden. "I recognized some names," she said. "These properties, they belong to families here. The Yoder's North Field, the Miller's grazing land." Her finger traced the neat columns. "All marked for rail easement clearance." Eli took the paper, understanding dawning like winter sunrise. "They mean to take the land," he said, "using false deeds like they tried with your husband." Lydia's face went pale. "No," she whispered. "Please, you can't get involved. You don't know what they're capable of." Her hands clutched at his sleeve. "They'll come for you next. They'll destroy everything you've built here." "They already came for you," Eli replied softly. Bea watched them both, her wise eyes sad. "Sometimes the Lord asks hard things of us," she said. "Not just to shelter truth, but to speak it." The forge fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow began falling again, each flake catching lamplight like a tiny star. Eli stood at the window, watching darkness settle over his peaceful home, knowing that peace might soon carry a higher price than he'd ever imagined. Lydia moved to stand beside him, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "I won't see another good man die for my cause," she said quietly. "It's not just your cause anymore," Eli answered, thinking of his neighbors' farms, their children's futures. The ledger in his hand felt heavy with responsibility. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold when thundering hoofbeats broke the morning silence. Sheriff Kincaid's horse kicked up snow as he reined to a stop before Eli's forge, its flanks dark with sweat despite the cold. Eli stepped out, wiping sleep from his eyes. The sheriff's expression turned his blood to ice. "Silas Dunn's been spotted in Gunnison," Kincaid said without preamble, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Mean piece of work. One of the railroad's worst enforcers. Word is he's heading this way." The name hung between them like frost. Eli had heard whispers about Dunn, a man who solved the company's problems with lead and terror. "How long?" Eli asked, his voice steady despite the fear churning inside. "Half-day's ride, maybe less." Kincaid shifted in his saddle. "You need to move her, Eli. Now." Within minutes, Eli had Lydia bundled in his wagon, covered with blankets and hay. The morning air bit sharp as he drove the short distance to Bay Stoltzfus's homestead. Bee met them at the door, her face etched with concern. "The cellar's ready," she said, leading them to a trap door beneath a worn rag rug. "We've hidden others here before." Lydia descended the wooden steps into darkness, carrying only a small lamp and the quilt from Eli's home. The cellar smelled of earth and stored apples. Root vegetables hung in neat rows from the beams, and shelves lined with preserved food stood against the walls. "I'll bring food when I can," Bee promised, her kind eyes meeting Lydia's. "The Lord watches, even underground." Back outside, Eli pulled the ledger scrap from his coat and showed it to the sheriff. Kincaid studied the neat columns of numbers and names, his weathered face growing grave. "This here's enough to hang someone," he said, running a finger along the false claims. "But it might hang the wrong people first." He folded the paper carefully. "Let me take this to Judge Harrison. He's no friend to the railroad. Might be our best chance at justice." "And if Dunn arrives before then?" "Stay out of it, Eli." Kincaid's voice carried both warning and plea. "Your people don't believe in violence. Don't let them force your hand." The day crept by like molasses in winter. Eli worked his forge, the familiar rhythm of hammer on anvil doing little to calm his thoughts. As evening approached, he brought bread and soup to the cellar. Lydia sat wrapped in his wife's quilt, her face pale in the lamplight. They broke bread together, the ancient gesture of peace feeling especially precious. Bee joined them, leading them in a quiet prayer of thanks and protection. When the others fell silent, Lydia spoke. "I don't understand," she said softly, looking at Eli. "You refused to fight in the war, left rather than raise a hand against others. Why risk everything now? For a stranger?" Eli set down his soup bowl, considering her words. The lamplight caught the silver threading his dark beard, the quiet strength in his broad shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried the same sureness as his hammer strikes. "Peace isn't hiding," he said, meeting her gaze. "It's choosing what deserves your hands." He spread his calloused palms. "These hands won't take life, but they can protect it, can work to set things right." Lydia studied him, seeing past the plain clothes and modest demeanor. This wasn't a meek man afraid of conflict, but one strong enough to choose a harder path, one the world's violence couldn't understand. "The war taught me that killing solves nothing," Eli continued, "but standing aside while evil works." He shook his head. "That's no peace at all." Outside, the storm that had raged for days began to fade, stars peeking through breaking clouds. But in the valley, something else was building, a tension thick as summer lightning. Bee touched the Bible she'd brought down. "The night is far spent," she quoted softly. "The day is at hand." They sat together in the cellar's close darkness, three souls bound by conscience and courage, waiting for whatever morning might bring. The railroad's shadow lay long across the valley, but here, underground, a different kind of strength was taking root, one built not on force, but on the quiet power of doing what was right. The days following Lydia's move to Bay and Jonas's homestead settled into a gentle rhythm. Morning frost melted under strengthening sun, and the land began its slow awakening from winter's grip. Each dawn brought a fresh sense of purpose as Lydia made her way to the small wooden schoolhouse where local orphans gathered to learn. At first, the Amish children hung back, their dark eyes watching her with curiosity mixed with uncertainty. But Lydia's patience and warmth soon drew them closer. She taught them their letters using worn primers, her voice soft as she guided small fingers across pages. "Like this," she would say, demonstrating how to form each character. See how the bee has 2 round bellies? The children giggled at her descriptions, their laughter a balm to her wounded spirit. Eli's daily visits became a cherished constant. He arrived with his tools, mending loose floorboards or adjusting stubborn door hinges. Sometimes he brought books, simple readers and collections of hymns, their pages dog-eared but treated with reverence. "Found these in my attic," he said one afternoon, setting a stack carefully on her desk. "Reckon they might be useful." His quiet thoughtfulness spoke louder than words. The routine of frontier life wrapped around Lydia like a warm shawl. She joined Bee in hanging laundry, the sheets snapping in the wind. She learned to milk goats alongside Jonas, her hands growing steadier with practice. Each task, no matter how humble, felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. One evening, Bee hosted a quilting circle. Women gathered with their needlework, voices soft as they stitched. With subtle grace, Bee arranged the seating so Lydia found herself beside Eli, who had stopped by with fresh-cut wood for the stove. "Would you teach me that hymn you were humming yesterday?" Lydia asked, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked her needle through the fabric. Their shoulders nearly touched as Eli leaned closer, his deep voice gentle as he guided her through the melody. "'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far," they sang together, the words filling the room with quiet hope. Some of the women joined in, though others remained silent, their backs turned in silent judgment. Sunday arrived clear and cool. Lydia stood before her mirror in a borrowed dress, smoothing nervous hands over the plain fabric. When she entered the meeting house, whispers rustled like dry leaves. Yet she held her head high, finding strength in Eli's steady presence a few benches away. The service moved through familiar patterns, prayers, scripture readings, hymns that reached toward heaven. Though some women pointedly avoided her gaze, others offered small nods of acknowledgement. It was a beginning. Afterward, Eli fell into step beside her for the walk home. The creek beside the path ran strong with melting snow, its voice a cheerful burble in the afternoon quiet. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable, shared. "Look there," Eli said suddenly, pointing upward. A flash of brilliant blue darted through the branches, the first bluebird of spring. Lydia caught her breath at its beauty, this small messenger of renewal. "I haven't seen one since." Her voice trailed off, but Eli understood. "Spring comes again," he said simply, "no matter how long the winter." They paused on the footbridge, watching the water flow beneath. The sun caught Lydia's hair, turning it to copper, and Eli found himself studying how peace had begun to soften the shadows in her eyes. Neither noticed, at first, the distant figure on the ridge, a lone rider sitting motionless against the sky. When Lydia finally spotted him, her hand clutched Eli's arm. The rider remained for several long moments, watching, before turning his horse and disappearing over the crest. But they refused to let fear steal this moment of grace. The bluebird's song still echoed in the warming air, and the creek continued its joyful journey toward distant valleys. Together, they walked the remaining distance to Bai and Jonas's home, their steps measured but unafraid. Inside, the house smelled of fresh bread and safety. Bee looked up from her Bible, her smile understanding. She had witnessed how healing could come in small ways, through children's trust, shared songs, and the simple act of walking home together on a spring afternoon. Sheriff Kincaid's horse kicked up dust as he galloped into Eli's yard, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the packed earth. His face was grim as he dismounted, spurs jingling against worn boots. "Got bad news, Eli," he said, pulling wrinkled papers from his coat. "These just came down from Denver." Eli wiped his sooty hands on his apron and stepped out of the forge. The cooling metal behind him pinged softly in the quiet air. "Railroads filed deeds," Kincaid continued, spreading the documents on a workbench. "They're claiming rights to several properties here in the valley, including your forge and the Stoltzfuse's farm." Eli's weathered fingers traced the official seals and flowing script. His eyes caught on a signature at the bottom of one deed, and his breath hitched. There, in careful black ink, was written E. Gunden. "That's not my hand," he said quietly. The forgery was skillful, but Eli knew every curve of his own signature from years of marking his metalwork. This was a stranger's crafted lie. Sheriff Kincaid nodded grimly. "Figured as much. But the paperwork's been registered now. Railroads claiming you and others signed over easement rights months ago." The implications settled heavy as anvil iron in Eli's chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. The entire community's land was at risk. He thought of Bee and Jonas, of the orphan children Lydia taught, of generations of careful stewardship threatened by a pen's stroke. "We need to see the clerk," Eli said, already reaching for his coat. The sheriff didn't argue. The ride to town passed in tense silence. Spring mud sucked at their horses' hooves, and overhead, hawks wheeled in circles, scanning for prey. Eli's thoughts churned like the creek waters they forded. How could he fight this evil while holding to his vows of peace? The county clerk's office smelled of dust and aging paper. Behind his high desk, the clerk barely glanced up from his ledger when they entered. His quill scratched steadily across the page, marking other men's fates in careful columns. "These signatures are forged," Eli said, laying the deeds before him. "I never signed away my land." The clerk adjusted his spectacles, examining the papers with exaggerated care. "Everything appears to be in order," he said finally. "Properly witnessed, properly sealed. Nothing I can do about it now." "But it's theft," Eli protested, his voice level despite the anger burning in his throat. The clerk shrugged, already turning back to his work. "Take it up with the circuit judge when he comes through, if you can afford the filing fees." On the ride home, movement caught Eli's eye. Riders on the ridge, their shapes dark against the setting sun. He recognized Silas Dunn's straight-backed posture, the way he sat his horse like a military man. The railroad's enforcers were no longer hiding their presence. Sheriff Kincaid saw them too. "They're getting bold," he muttered. "Watch yourself, Eli. Men like that don't stop at paper wars." Night settled over the valley like a heavy blanket. In Bee and Jonas's kitchen, Lydia paced, her skirts swishing against the floorboards. When Eli finished explaining about the deeds, she pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes bright with tears. "This is my fault," she whispered. "They followed me here. Now they're taking everything." "No," Eli said firmly. "Evil chooses its own path. You're not to blame." Lydia crossed to where he sat, her fingers twisting together. "We could leave," she said urgently. "Go to Kansas Territory. Start fresh where they can't find us. Please, Eli." The longing in her voice tugged at him, but Eli shook his head. "I can't abandon the others. The Stoltzfuses, the children you teach. They depend on us." "Then they'll destroy you too," Lydia said, her voice breaking. Eli stood, gently touching her shoulder. "Perhaps. But running from evil only gives it more power." Later, alone in his forge, Eli worked steel into horseshoes, each hammer blow a prayer for guidance. The fire roared and dimmed, like the pulse of his own heart. Sparks flew upward into the darkness, brief as shooting stars. His muscles burned with effort as he shaped the metal, but he couldn't stop. Each finished shoe felt like a small victory against chaos, proof that honest work still held meaning in a world of false papers and official lies. The night deepened around him, but still Eli worked, pouring his fury into creation rather than destruction. By dawn, a neat row of horseshoes lined his bench, each one perfect, each one true. His hands were blistered, but his mind was clear. Whatever came next, he would face it standing firm on the land God had given him to tend. The days melted one into another like spring snow into earth. Lydia moved her few belongings back to Eli's home, her presence filling empty corners with quiet grace. Together they fell into gentle rhythms, morning prayers, daily work, evening meals shared in comfortable silence. In the forge, Lydia learned to work the bellows while Eli shaped metal. Her arms grew stronger as she helped rebuild his collection of tools. The steady whoosh of air feeding the flames became like breath to them both, a meditation of sorts. "Hand me that hammer?" Eli would ask, and Lydia would know which one he meant without asking. Their movements grew naturally coordinated, like dancers who'd practiced for years instead of days. One afternoon, they tended the injured mare Eli had rescued from a ditch the previous week. Lydia's fingers were gentle as she changed the poultice on the horse's leg. The animal's dark eyes were soft with trust. "You have healing hands," Eli said, watching her work. Lydia paused, her fingers still buried in the mare's mane. "I never thought I'd feel useful again," she admitted. "After what happened?" The forge fire crackled behind them, throwing warm light across their faces. Eli checked the mare's water bucket, buying time to find the right words. "Have you ever struck someone?" Lydia asked suddenly. "In anger, I mean." Eli's movements stilled. The question hung between them like smoke. Finally, he nodded. "Once, during the war." He leaned against the stable wall, his eyes distant. "I was a conscript, tried to serve as a stretcher-bearer, tending the wounded. But one day," his voice roughened, "one day I saw a man beating a young soldier who'd surrendered. Something in me broke. I struck him so hard he nearly died." Lydia touched his arm gently. "You were defending someone weaker." "No." Eli's voice was firm. "I acted in rage, not mercy. That moment cost me my faith for a long time, made me question everything I believed about peace." The mare nickered softly, nudging Lydia's shoulder. She stroked its velvet nose, gathering courage for her own confession. "After they hurt me," she said quietly, "I wanted to die. Prayed for it even. But now—" She looked around the warm stable, at the tools they'd made together, at Eli's patient face. "Now I find myself hoping again. For life." That evening, they attended a quilting bee at the Stoltzfus home. Women's voices rose in hymns as needles flashed by lamplight. Lydia sat near Eli, their shoulders almost touching as they worked on opposite sides of the frame. The quilt pattern was called Jacob's Ladder, ascending in neat geometric steps. Lydia's stitches were small and even, each one a tiny act of creation. Eli's larger hands moved more slowly, but with careful precision. In the golden lamp glow, surrounded by soft singing, Lydia leaned close to whisper, "Maybe the Lord mends people like quilts, one torn piece at a time." Eli's hands stilled on the fabric. He looked at her, really looked, seeing, past the scars to the strength beneath. A smile touched his lips, gentle as dawn light. Something stirred in his heart, like winter ice breaking up in spring. Outside in the gathering dark, unseen by those within, Silas Dunn sat his horse beneath a stand of pines. His cold eyes marked the glow of the forge, the pattern of paths between buildings, the daily routines of the people who lived there. His fingers drummed against his saddle horn as he planned what would come next. But inside, the quilting continued. Voices lifted in harmony. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The lamp burned steady, casting pools of light across the careful work of hands and hearts, learning to trust again. Night settled over the valley like a wool blanket, stars pricking through the darkness above. Inside Eli's home, the evening prayers drew to a close. Lydia's voice joined his in the final Amen, soft but steady. The familiar words brought peace to them both after the long day's work. A sudden chorus of barking shattered the quiet. Dogs from 3 farms raised the alarm, their voices urgent and afraid. Eli rose from his chair, moving to the window. An orange glow flickered against the glass. "Fire!" The word tore from his throat as he saw flames leaping from his forge. The wooden roof was already burning, sparks swirling up into the night sky. He ran for the door, Lydia close behind. "The tools," he gasped. "Everything I've made." He sprinted toward the burning building. Years of work, his father's anvil, the hammers and tongs that were extensions of his hands, all would be lost if he didn't reach them. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness. Something hard struck Eli's head, sending him sprawling. Through blurred vision, he saw 3 mounted men. Their horses danced in the firelight, steam rising from their flanks. "Evening, brother," came a smooth voice. Silas Dunn sat tall in his saddle, fingering his watch chain. "Seems you've got a problem with your forge." 2 enforcers grabbed Lydia. Her scream cut through the crackle of flames as they dragged her toward their horses. She fought like a wild thing, but they were too strong. "No!" Eli tried to rise. Another blow sent him back to the earth. He tasted blood. "The lady and I need to discuss some business matters," Silas said. "Railroad business. Don't trouble yourself about it." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's ride, boys. The canyon trail's waiting." Eli reached out as Lydia was thrown across a saddle. Her eyes found his in the firelight, wide with terror. Then the riders spurred their mounts west, hoofbeats fading into darkness. The forge collapsed in a shower of sparks. Eli lay in the dirt, consciousness slipping away as his life's work burned to ash. His last thought was of Lydia's face, disappearing into the night. When he woke, the sun was rising. Sheriff Kincaid knelt beside him, concern etched on his weathered features. The forge was a smoking ruin. Timbers, still glowing red in places. "Found your tracks in the road," the sheriff said. "Followed them quick as I could, but—" He shook his head. "They're headed for Canyon Creek. 3 riders, moving fast." Eli touched his temple, fingers coming away sticky with dried blood. Inside him, something was breaking. The vow of peace he'd lived by since the war splintered like dry kindling. Violence called to the darkness in his heart, promising vengeance. He stumbled to his feet. "I have to go after them." "Eli." Kincaid's voice was gentle. "These men kill for sport. You're no gunfighter." "No." Eli looked at the ruins of his forge, remembering Lydia's smile as she worked the bellows. "But I am a man who made a promise to protect her." Inside his house, he knelt beside his bed. The morning light streamed through the window as he prayed, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Lord, guide my hands," he whispered. "Show me how to save her without losing my soul." When he rose, his path was clear. He packed quickly. Bread, dried meat, a water skin. His father's Bible went into the saddlebag. Last, he lifted his old blacksmith's hammer, testing its familiar weight. The rifle above the door stayed where it hung. Outside, B. Stoltzfus waited. She must have seen the smoke at dawn. Her kind face was solemn as she handed him a small packet of herbs. "For healing," she said. "Both kinds." Eli mounted his horse, the hammer secured at his belt. The morning wind carried the smell of ashes as he turned toward the western trail. "May the Lord make thy hand strong for mercy," B called after him. He rode out as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the smoking ruins of his forge and the shattered pieces of his peaceful life. Ahead lay the canyon lands, and somewhere in their shadows, a test of everything he believed about violence, justice, and the true meaning of strength. The hoofbeats of his horse marked time like a heartbeat as the miles began to unspool beneath him. In his mind, Lydia's voice echoed, "Maybe the Lord mends people like quilts, one torn piece at a time." He prayed she would live to see if it was true. The mountain trail wound higher into the Colorado peaks, like a serpent's back. Fresh snow dusted the ground, obscuring tracks that Eli desperately needed to follow. His horse's breath came in white clouds as they picked their way through the gathering storm. The afternoon light grew dim and gray, shadows stretching long across the frozen landscape. Every few yards, Eli dismounted to check for signs, a broken twig, a scuffed stone, anything to confirm he still followed Silas's gang. His head throbbed where they had struck him, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight in his heart. Each step took him further from the peaceful life he had built since the war. As darkness approached, he made camp beside a creek locked in winter's grip. The water still moved beneath the ice, its muffled song a lonely companion. Eli gathered wood with numb fingers and lit a small fire, careful to shield it from view. His horse stamped restlessly, sensing his unease. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, "guide my hands toward mercy, not vengeance." The words floated away on the bitter wind, and memories rushed in to fill the silence. Suddenly he was back in Tennessee, 1863. Gunsmoke filled his lungs. A Confederate soldier, no older than himself, lay bleeding in the mud. Eli's rifle barrel was still warm. The dying boy's eyes held such confusion. Why would an Amish man take up arms? That night, Eli had made his vow before God. Never again would he raise his hand in violence. He blinked away the vision, but others followed. The screams of wounded men, the thunder of cannons, the weight of his dead friend Samuel in his arms. Eli pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to push back the flood of remembrance. "Show me another way," he pleaded to the stars now appearing between snow clouds. "Help me save her without becoming what I once was." Morning brought clearer skies, but deeper snow. Eli led his horse carefully along a narrow ridge, scanning the white expanse below. Near midday, a flash of color caught his eye, something dark against the snow. His heart clenched as he retrieved Lydia's bonnet, its strings torn. Nearby, fresh hoof prints veered sharply east toward the hulking shapes of old mine works in the distance. Miles away, in a decrepit mining camp, Lydia huddled against a rotting support beam. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, her face bruised where Silas had struck her for praying. The three men lounged around their fire, passing a whiskey bottle, confident no one would find them here. "Your Amish friend ain't coming for you," Silas drawled, kicking dirt toward her. "Those people don't believe in fighting. It's against their religion." He laughed, and his men joined in. Lydia closed her eyes, moving her lips in silent prayer. Not for rescue. She prayed Eli would stay away. She had seen goodness bloom again in his gentle soul. She couldn't bear to watch violence destroy him. Above the camp, heavy clouds gathered like a fist, promising more snow. "Look at her, still praying," one of the men sneered. "Ain't no God up in these mountains, woman. Just us sinners." The day waned, painting the canyon walls bloody red. Eli reached the rim just as the last sunlight faded. Below, a campfire flickered like a fallen star. He could make out 3 figures moving around it, and a fourth, smaller, separate, that had to be Lydia. His fingers found the hammer at his belt, its familiar weight both comfort and temptation. The tool trembled in his grip, but not from fear. Something stronger than fear moved through him now, a clarity sharp as mountain air. Violence and peace were not opposite paths, he realized. Sometimes the deepest peace required the courage to act. Eli touched the hammer's worn handle, remembering all it had created in his forge. Tools for planting, implements of harvest, shoes for horses that carried children to school. The marks it left had always been for building, never breaking. "Let it be so again," he whispered into the gathering dark. The storm clouds above mirrored his resolve, not a wild tempest of rage, but the steady purpose of spring rain that brings new life. He studied the cliff face, noting hand and footholds. In the camp below, Silas's men had no idea that high above them, an Amish blacksmith was preparing to test his faith in ways he had never imagined. The hammer hung ready at his belt, not as a weapon, but as a testament to the strength of creating over destroying. Eli waited, watching the campfires glow. The moment had come to discover if a man could fight for peace without losing his soul in the effort. The first light of dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and amber. Eli Gundon stepped onto the narrow path leading down to the camp, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. He carried no weapon, only his faith and the rising sun at his back. Below, one of Silas's men stirred, poking at the dying embers of their fire. His startled shout roused the others. Silas Dunn emerged from beneath his blanket, hand already on his pistol. His bleary eyes widened at the sight of the tall Amish man descending toward them. "Well, if it ain't the peaceful preacher," Silas called out, voice rough with mockery. "Come to preach us to death?" Eli continued his measured pace down the trail. "No," he answered, voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I came to stand where you fell." The words hung between them like frost. Silas's men exchanged uncertain glances, hands hovering near their weapons. Their horses stamped nervously, sensing the tension. Near the wagon, Lydia stirred. Her wrists were bound, her face marked with bruises, but her eyes blazed as she watched Eli approach. She tried to call out a warning, but her parched throat produced only a rasping whisper. Eli walked steadily forward until he stood between the armed men and Lydia. The morning light caught his broad shoulders, casting his shadow long across the snow. He made no aggressive move, yet his presence filled the space with quiet authority. Silas's face twisted. "You're either brave or stupid, Gundon." He stepped forward and struck Eli hard across the face with his pistol. The blow rocked Eli back, blood trickling from his split lip. But he did not raise his hands or step aside. He simply straightened, eyes steady on Silas's face. "Move," Silas snarled, raising his gun, "or I'll send you to meet your maker." A low rumble rolled through the canyon. At first it seemed distant as thunder. Then the sound grew, accompanied by an ominous cracking from the ridge above. Eli's eyes snapped upward. The morning sun had begun to melt the snowpack, destabilizing the ridge. As they watched in horror, an avalanche of wet snow and ice broke free, cascading down the canyon wall. "Run!" someone shouted, but it was too late. The avalanche struck their camp like God's own hand, burying the horses and scattering the fire in an explosion of steam and snow. Men dove for cover as chunks of ice and frozen earth rained down. Through the chaos, Eli fought his way to Lydia. His fingers, steady despite the danger, worked at her bonds. The moment she was free, he pulled her up the slope, away from the worst of the slide. "Help!" the cry came from below. "Help me!" Through the swirling snow, they saw Silas trapped beneath a fallen tree, snow piling around him. His men had fled, leaving him to his fate. Lydia clutched Eli's arm. "Leave him," she whispered. after what he did? But Eli was already moving. He scrambled down the treacherous slope, boots sliding in the wet snow. Reaching Silas, he braced his shoulders against the tree trunk and heaved. Muscles straining, he managed to lift it just enough for Silas to drag himself free. The railroad man lay gasping, blood staining the snow beneath him. His eyes, already glazing, found Eli's face. "Why?" Silas wheezed. "Why help me?" "Because God's mercy is bigger than man's evil," Eli answered simply. In the distance, hoofbeats approached, Sheriff Kincaid's posse, finally catching up. But they would arrive too late for Silas. His injuries were too severe. "I'm sorry," Silas whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Lord, have mercy on my soul." His eyes closed for the final time, his last breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. Lydia made her way down to them, trembling. She stared at the man who had destroyed her life, now lying still in the blood-stained snow. Tears spilled down her face as she turned to Eli. "He saved the man who ruined me," she whispered, voice breaking with wonder and grief. Eli stood quietly beside her as the sun climbed higher, melting the snow around them drop by drop. In the distance, the sheriff's men appeared on the ridge, their arrival heralded by the jingle of tack and creak of leather. The avalanche had reshaped the canyon, burying the old under pure white snow. Like God's grace, it had swept away both good and evil, leaving only truth behind. That mercy, freely given, holds more power than any weapon ever forged. Sheriff Kincaid and his deputies crested the ridge, their horses' hooves crunching through the fresh snow. The morning sun glinted off their badges as they surveyed the aftermath of the avalanche. Steam still rose from scattered patches where the snowslide had upended the camp. "Dear Lord," Kincaid muttered, taking in the scene. The dead horses, the overturned wagon, and Silas Dunn's body lying still in the blood-stained snow. His keen eyes noted Eli standing protectively near Lydia, both of them alive, but battered. Two deputies immediately began searching through the scattered camp supplies, while Kincaid dismounted and picked his way down the slope. His weathered face showed both concern and relief as he reached them. "Miss Holcomb," he said gently, "you're safe now." He turned to Eli, noting the blacksmith's split lip and bruised face. "You did good, Gundon, though I reckon this wasn't quite what the bishop had in mind for turning the other cheek." One of the deputies called out, waving a leather satchel he'd pulled from the wreckage. "Sheriff, found something." Kincaid took the satchel and opened it, revealing a stack of official-looking papers. His eyes narrowed as he examined them. "Well, well, looks like Mr. Dunn kept his forgeries close at hand." Lydia stepped forward, her voice hoarse but steady. "Those deeds, they're all false. The ledger piece we found proves it. The railroad was stealing land through fraud and violence." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Got the ledger fragment safe in my office. Between that and these papers..." He gestured at the forged documents. "Well, Judge Harrison's been looking for evidence of railroad corruption. This ought to do nicely." As the deputies wrapped Silas's body for transport, Kincaid helped Eli and Lydia mount up behind two of his men. The slow ride back to town gave Lydia time to share her full story: her husband's murder, her assault, and the railroad's systematic theft of land from honest settlers. 3 days later, they gathered in the Gunnison courthouse. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, listened intently as Lydia testified. Her quiet strength filled the wooden chamber as she detailed the railroad's crimes. The forged deeds and ledger fragment provided the physical evidence, but it was her unwavering voice that moved the court to action. The judge's gavel fell like thunder. "This court orders full restitution to all affected parties," he declared. "The railroad's false claims are hereby nullified. All seized properties will be returned to their rightful owners, with damages paid." A murmur of relief rippled through the assembled Amish families. B. Stoltzfus squeezed her husband's hand, tears of joy in her eyes. The railroad's lawyer stepped forward, holding out a bank draft toward Eli. "The company offers compensation for your burned forge, Mr. Gundon, and a reward for your discretion." Eli didn't even glance at the money. "Peace was the only wage I sought," he said quietly. "Keep your gold. Just restore what was stolen." Later that evening, Lydia sat in B's parlor, wrapped in a quilt as she recovered. Spring's first warm breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Eli had come to check on her, as he did each day. "Why did you risk everything?" she asked, watching his face in the fading light. "Your life, your vow of peace. You could have lost it all." Eli's eyes met hers, gentle but unwavering. "Because you were worth the hammer in my hand," he answered simply. Outside, the last patches of snow were melting away from the valley. Where Eli's forge had stood, the first green shoots pushed through the ashes, reaching toward the warmth of spring sunshine. B's garden showed similar signs of renewal. Crocus buds and tender grass blades emerging from winter's retreat. Sheriff Kincaid, passing by on his evening rounds, reined in to watch the sunset paint the valley gold. He smiled at the sight of children playing near the schoolhouse again, their voices carrying on the wind. The shadow of fear that had haunted the community was lifting, like winter giving way to spring. In the Stoltzfus kitchen, Bee hummed an old hymn as she prepared supper, glancing occasionally at Eli and Lydia talking quietly by the window. The light in their faces spoke of hope restored, not the swift, dramatic hope of stories, but the slow, steady kind that grows like spring flowers through thawing ground. Truth had prevailed without violence, justice had come through persistence rather than vengeance, and peace, true peace, was proving stronger than any weapon, just as Eli had believed all along. Warm spring sunshine bathed the valley as hammers rang out across Eli Gundon's property. Where charred timbers had littered the ground, a new forge rose steadily. Neighbors who had once turned away in fear now worked shoulder to shoulder, raising heavy beams and fitting sturdy planks. The rhythm of their labor echoed like a hymn of redemption through the Colorado highlands. Inside what remained of the old barn, Lydia sat by the window, measuring cotton fabric for curtains. Her fingers, once trembling with terror, now moved with purpose across the cloth. She paused occasionally to watch Eli directing the work outside, his quiet strength drawing the community together in ways she had never imagined possible. The adjoining section of the barn had been cleaned and renovated, transformed into a modest shelter. Fresh straw filled the sleeping pallets, and plain but sturdy furniture lined the walls. Lydia had insisted on creating this haven for travelers and widows, knowing too well how desperate the need for sanctuary could be. Bishop Enoch Lapp stood in the doorway, observing the industry before him. His stern features softened as he watched Eli help a young boy straighten a nail. The bishop had seen how mercy, not judgment, had knit their community stronger. When Eli and Lydia approached him about marriage, he offered his blessing without hesitation. The wedding supper filled the newly rebuilt forge with warmth and light. B. Stoltzfus sat in the corner, her dulcimer across her lap, playing the ancient melodies that had carried their people through countless trials. The music wove through the gathered crowd, binding them together in celebration. Sheriff Kincaid arrived late, having ridden straight from his rounds. He removed his hat, surveying the scene with satisfaction before raising his cup of cider. "To courage without bullets," he declared, his voice carrying over the pleasant murmur of conversation. and to two souls who taught us all what real strength looks like." As evening settled over the valley, lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, hanging from the branches of the old cottonwood tree. Their light cast soft shadows across the ground where Lydia had first stumbled into Eli's life months ago, half frozen and desperate. Now she stood there again, but this time as his wife, surrounded by the warmth of acceptance and love. Eli and Lydia walked beneath the glowing lanterns, their footsteps slow and peaceful. She reached for his calloused hand, pressing her palm against his. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for making beauty from broken iron." Her words carried the weight of their shared journey, from violence to peace, from despair to hope. The lantern light caught the silver threads in Bee's shawl as she played one final hymn, its notes drifting out into the gathering dusk. Around them, the community that had once whispered in fear now sang together in joy, their voices rising in harmony under the Colorado stars. The spring melt swelled the creek banks, rushing down from the mountains in torrents that carved new paths through the valley. But as April turned to May, the waters gradually receded, leaving behind rich, dark soil along the banks. Fresh grass sprouted in abundance where the floods had swept through, as if nature itself celebrated the renewal of the land. Eli and Lydia stood before their newly completed forge, now bearing a freshly painted sign that read, "Lydia's Crossing Smithy and Refuge," in careful letters. The morning sun caught the droplets of dew still clinging to the wood, making them sparkle like tiny stars. "You sure about the name?" Eli asked softly, his hand resting on the small of Lydia's back. She nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. "This place should stand for more than just metalwork. It needs to be a beacon for those who've lost their way, like I once did." Inside, the forge area gleamed with Eli's restored tools, while the adjoining space welcomed travelers with simple comforts, clean bedding, sturdy chairs, and a pot of soup always simmering on the wood stove. The scent of fresh-baked bread wafted through the building as Lydia pulled another golden loaf from the oven. Their first visitor of the spring arrived before noon, a farmer with a broken plow blade. As Eli examined the metal, Lydia offered the man coffee and bread. Soon he was sharing his troubles, a sick wife, worried children. Before he left, repaired plow in hand, Lydia and Eli had prayed with him, and his shoulders seemed lighter as he drove away. More travelers followed. Word spread about the smithy where broken things and broken spirits found mending. A wagon train passed through, and while Eli repaired their wheel rims, Lydia tended to a young mother's fever. The other women gathered in the refuge, sharing stories and finding strength in each other's company. One sunny afternoon, Sarah Miller, a young girl Lydia had taught during her early days in the valley, appeared at the door. Her arms overflowed with wildflowers gathered from the meadow. Purple lupine, golden banner, and delicate columbine. "These are for you, Miss Lydia," Sarah said shyly, though Lydia was now properly Mrs. Gundon. The girl's eyes shone with admiration. "I remember how you taught us about spring flowers, even when you were hurting so bad yourself." Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the bouquet, touched by the child's remembrance. She arranged the flowers in a simple tin cup, placing them where their colors would brighten the refuge's common room. Sheriff Kincaid arrived later that week, leading a small work crew. They carried tools and a large wooden post with them. "County's finally getting around to marking these roads proper," he explained, directing his men to dig near the crossing. "Seemed right to name this one after someone who helped bring justice to the valley." By sunset, a new sign stood at the intersection. "Holcomb Road." Lydia pressed her hands to her mouth when she saw it, overwhelmed by the gesture. Eli squeezed her shoulder gently, understanding all the sign represented. Not just a name, but a victory over those who had tried to erase her. As twilight deepened into dusk, Eli prepared to light the forge's first fire of the season. The ritual held special meaning this year, marking not just the return of spring, but the triumph of light over darkness. He arranged the kindling carefully, showing the same patience he brought to all his tasks. Lydia stood in the doorway, watching him work. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming wild plum, sweet and promising. Her hand traced the rough wood of the doorframe, remembering how far they had come from that bitter winter night. "They broke my body for fun," she said softly, the words no longer carrying their former sting. A smile broke through her tears as she looked at her husband. But God sent a man who would rather die than break another soul. Eli paused in his work, turning to meet her gaze. No words were needed between them. Their shared journey spoke louder than any declaration could. Together they watched as the first flames caught and grew, sending sparks dancing upward into the darkening sky. The familiar ring of hammer on anvil soon followed, its steady rhythm echoing across the valley like a heartbeat. Each strike spoke of mercy's victory, of love's power to rebuild what hatred had torn down. The smoke rose straight and true toward heaven, carrying with it the promise of healing for all who would find their way to Lydia's crossing. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.